Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming in here for a talk on Kashmir, politics of religion and rights. My name is Surya. This talk is being co-hosted by Dr Nitasha, headed by Professor John Francis Bea, and a student initiative on understanding Kashmir. We'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Bea for having allowed us to hold this discussion under his chair. Our initiative is a discussion-based group which was started last semester because of an uneasy silence on Kashmir in an international space like the Institute. We feel that there is a general ignorance on the conflict in Kashmir within the international community, and any conversation on Kashmir does not go beyond the territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. And this strategically crafted narrative continuously works to obliterate the lived experiences and the everyday lives of people of Kashmir. Our initiative is an attempt to have a conversation on this issue, and we try to amplify Kashmiri voices through Kashmiri by having conversations through Kashmiri artists, academics, writers, and activists.
Thank you very much, Surya. My name is Kajan. On 4th of August 2019, my host family in Pulwama in South Kashmir made sure that I reached Srinagar, the capital city, safely, a day before my scheduled departure to Bombay. The preceding couple of days were filled with extreme anxiety and fear of not knowing amongst the Kashmiri people. Long queues at the ATMs and petrol pumps, tourists and pilgrims being asked to evacuate as soon as possible, and a soldier every 20 meters made my host family believe that the Indian state was soon to unleash yet another round of atrocities on the people of Kashmir. Next day, on 5th of August, the staff of the hotel I was staying in knocked heavily at my door at 7:30 in the morning and asked me to leave as soon as possible. As I navigated through the heavily militarized geography of an unknown city, covered at most places with barbed wires and an entirely suspended public transport system, I was fortunate to hitchhike and reach the airport. Over the past few days of my stay in Kashmir, I had realized that the geography in Kashmir, which was plagued by the overt presence of gun soldiers, was in complete contrast with the warmth of its people. An example of the atmosphere of fear and panic created by the Indian state was visible when I saw that Indian students were being flown out of Kashmir without tickets, as if it was a war zone that the students were being rescued from. This talk today is not only about the abrogation of the special status of Kashmir and the following siege for 115 days now, but it is also about the history of oppression, the denial of rights, and how the politics of religion converses with both of them. I am extremely happy to have amongst us Dr Nitasha Kaul as our guest speaker for today. Professor Julie Villot, who is an associate professor of anthropology and sociology at the Institute, will be moderating the discussion. I would now request Professor Julie to take over from me. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr Nitasha Kaul, a London-based scholar who combines many talents. Indeed, Nitasha is a Kashmiri novelist, academic, poet, economist, artist, and teacher. Maybe I forget a few other things. At present, she's an associate professor in politics and international relations at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster in London, where she has been teaching postgraduate courses in politics and international relations since 2012. Her intellectual interests include right-wing politics, the links between post-colonialism, neoliberalism, and nationalism, and in particular the manifestation through Hindutva in India, the history and politics of Kashmir, politics and biodemocracy in Bhutan, and gender, border, violence, and the nation state. Her first book was actually not discussing Kashmir, but was rather concerned with economics. Imagining Economics Otherwise, Encounters with Identity Difference, was published with Routledge in 2007. A critique of economics as a discipline, the book questions assumptions of timeliness, universality, and objectivity that underpin economic knowledge by tracing its ideological and cultural roots within liberal Enlightenment philosophy. In the book, Dr. Kaul advocates for a more plural form of economic thinking, one that is sensitive to identity politics and that incorporates feminist post-structural and post-colonial theory, a project she coins economixes. In 2018, together with Professor Atexia, Nitasha Kaul co-edited a special issue of Economic and Political Weekly on women and Kashmir, bringing together for the first time works of women on women and Kashmir by Kashmiri scholars themselves. Her first novel, Residue, dealt with Kashmiris outside of Kashmir and was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, also known as the Asian Booker, in 2009. The novel is an exploration of mobility and affinity across the borders of nation and faith, of class-stratified urban India, divided Berlin, and the complication of identity in England. Nitasha Kaul has discussed the situation in Kashmir in many news as well as academic journal articles. Most recently, last month actually, she has been called as a witness to give her expert testimony on the situation of human rights in Kashmir in front of the US House of Representatives. So we are therefore very honored to have you here, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaul.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was a very thoughtful introduction. I can see that. Thank you all for being here to hear about Kashmir. And one can talk about the story of Kashmir in with different lenses of zoom, and in different with fast or slow time. And time is very non-linear in conflict zones anyway. So I'm going to switch lenses, as it were, at different points. But I want to just begin by having this in the backdrop, this idea of which I guess you might be aware of what has been happening since August the 5th. So since the article of the Indian Constitution, Article 370, since that was altered, and Kashmir's autonomy, which had been eroded over time anyway, was taken away, and the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir was bifurcated into Jammu and Kashmir being a union territory and Ladakh being another. This also has political implications, add to which there's the arbitrary way in which this whole thing was carried out, as Surya and Fabian have also pointed out, the way in which it literally happened overnight with no consultation, consent of any people. There was not the government there, which wasn't in place, not the courts. And since then, we have witnessed a situation where people's human rights are being trampled upon with an accelerated kind of impunity. So you would remember that this is, and then I'll actually begin and trace the longer story. But I just want to give you the brief story first. And in the congressional testimony, the written document, which is a 12-page document, there are details. So subsequent to this, there was a complete ban on communications, initially completely, including landlines, mobile phones of any kind. So if you can imagine that, what are the sorts of hardship that would impose on people, just not being able to reach for help, for medical emergency, for anything at all. And since then, there has been this, again, fairly arbitrary way in which, in a drip feed method, some of these decisions have been reversed. So landlines, after more than a month, landlines were restored. Post-paid phones were restored, which meant people had to first go and pay their bills for services they hadn't used. And anyway, most people use prepaid phones, and prepaid phones and SMSs still aren't restored. Internet was shut down. It's not the first time that the internet has been turned off. I was in fact there in the early autumn of 2017 2017, if I remember correctly, when this happened. So within a few minutes, you may be on a street or somewhere, and within a few minutes, you start to ask people around, is yours still working? Is yours still working? And within 15 minutes, everyone's just completely off grid. So the internet was shut down, but what is different is that it's an unprecedented amount of time that it has been going on, and with the internet shutdown, also there is there's limited pockets where you can access the internet. So there's a media center where it was possible to access the internet for a limited amount of time for journalists that were approved, not freelance journalists, not publications that weren't seen as people who should have access to the internet. So this then meant that, as you can see, what has been unfolding is an arbitrary exercise of power. And I think throughout the longer history of Kashmir, what you see is that this arbitrariness and the lack of accountability, the lack of anything actually being followed to the norms, there being no rules that are being followed, so it depends on the benevolence of the people in power whether they want to allow something or not, and when they want to shut it down. So that in itself is a problem. Apart from this, the siege situation, the loss to businesses, to people there, to people working in various sectors, to people in industries relating to horticulture, agricultural products, tremendous losses over this period, apart from tourism as well. So there's a multi-dimensional form of imposed hardship and destitution that the people there have been facing. And this in itself is a grievous cause for worry. If you think about the fact that when in other places in the world, internet is turned off for just a few days to enable certain modalities of killing more outrightly, rather than imposing structural debility and a kind of insidious way of killing people, you can see that the international community cares. But there's much less care when that happens in the in the case of Kashmir. So there's this, and I will also, through the course of the talk, refer to the reasons that are given for why this is the case. I just want to make sure that I don't spend too much time on the background, because I'm guessing you might be aware of this. The other things that I would like you to remember is that this has been followed by an unprecedented atmosphere of toxic nationalism in India, hyper-nationalism even, where all of this is justified, where people turn up on TV studios to justify this, where commentators, only those commentators who justify what is being carried out, only those voices are amplified in the mainstream state-centric media, where everything is portrayed as this is about an alien other population, this is about the Muslims, or this is about Pakistani terrorists, and the reality is a lot more complex, and certainly not the way in which it is projected in India. But Kashmir is very central to the Hindutva project of transforming the state into a Hindu India, and that is a stated objective of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, which is the ideological parent of the current ruling party, the BJP. Again, I'm amazed that everyone in the world doesn't know about RSS, because everyone must. It is, it's some of its early important figures openly admired Hitler. They wrote about the, how the idea of a pure nation was good. There's people who work on Hindutva history. You can find references clearly. So this is a nationwide, proto-fascist kind of group where people wear uniforms, they have their salutes, they get together, they call themselves an NGO, but they have branches in every organization of society. So it's a rather different kind of transformation that is happening within India, which is not the usual kind. It's not simply the political party. It's a silencing of all dissent as anti-national. So if people dissent, and in different, there's a hierarchy, of course. You could be Kashmiri Muslim, you could be Muslim, you could be an environmentalist, you could be a minority rights activist, a human rights activist, somebody who's concerned about media freedom. So in a specific hierarchy, they are all labeled anti-national. Most recently, and this is paralleled by other developments happening in India, including constitutional case judgments. So this is this is a kind of large-scale transformation that is happening within India, which should be worrying for everyone, because these ideological projects do not stay within the nice lines that people draw on maps. There are people, ideas travel across borders. Increasingly, the diaspora has a very important role. And if anyone, and I always assume that I'm talking less to people who agree with me and more to people who don't know what I'm going to be saying and more to people who actually disagree with me, because I want this point. I don't think that there's any lack of facts or empirical evidence in even very patriotic Indians to be concerned about what is happening in India at this point. With the second victory of the present government, Modi-led BJP, there's various ways in which there are problems with it. You can look at the role of the electoral bonds. You can look at the way in which the dissent in the election commission was not recorded. There's all of that. There's the whole kind of processual aspect of it. But there's also the way in which the rhetoric that was mobilized for this election was very openly about Hindutva. Unlike the elections in 2014, where Hindutva and development were, development was as important as Hindutva, at least in rhetoric. But now, with the economy doing not as well, and that's an understatement, now with the economy doing not as well, Hindutva has become the key way in which people are being mobilized to continue supporting this project. And it is a worrying tremendously worrying thing when an ex-army person turns up on a TV studio and says, a rape for a rape. In order to avenge Kashmiri Pandit, the Kashmiri Hindu minority, who were driven out at the end of the 80s and early 90s, that in order to avenge that, it is all right to rape Muslim women. That's the level of thinking where this is at. And the competing victimhoods thing, this endless, my history is better than yours, my memory is more traumatic than yours, is a key part. And this is why the current project, the current Hindutva project, needs to keep that entrenched, that divide entrenched, and to not let the solidarities develop. Anyway, so that's all to say that there is a lot of facts out there, and also to those who may want to look further, there have been various reports by Indians, and I emphasize this is not just Kashmiris saying things, by Indians. One of them was called Women's Voice. This is from September 2019. One was called Kashmir Civil Disobedience, a citizen's report. This was also in the last 2 months. One was called Kashmir Caged, a fact-finding report. And all of these reports by Indian human rights activists, men and women both, have documented the horrors of the situation, the traumas that Kashmiris are facing, and why something needs doing about it. So there is plenty there. Okay. Now I will get to what I really want to talk to you about, which is the longer history. So I think I want to start by saying this part of the talk by saying that what is really significant in all of this is the role played by narratives and the imaginaries, the idea of Kashmir, and why the obsession is so central, to the extent that Kashmiris can be killed, but Kashmir cannot be something that can be seen as a political dispute, which it is and has a history of being. It is also a mobilization of histories, the claim to an indigeneity. I mean, in Kashmir, depends on how far back you go. There's Buddhists, there's early site of Buddhism, there's Hindu rulers, there's Mughal dynasty, Central Asian originating Afghan and Mughal dynasties, there's Sikh rule, then there's the Dogra rule in the 19th century, then you come to the Kashmiri nationalism, incipient forms of Kashmiri nationalism in the early 20th century. So and different histories, different tellings of those histories use different starting points. In India, the starting point doesn't go usually any further than the late 80s, because it's the late 80s, following on from the 87 elections, the cross-border Pakistan infiltrated terrorism, Muslim extremists, and then justification of everything in those terms. There is honestly, there is just the level. I actually think that it is agnotology. It is the deliberate and systematic maintenance of ignorance amongst the population in India from knowing the facts, so that they continue to lend consent for things that they would not if they actually knew what was going on, which is why the world community, the international community, has a role. So there is and what makes it even more worrying is that all of this is happening against a global backdrop, which is a precarious moment of delinking from globally interlinked architecture of norms. We have the climate change crisis, we have the Anthropocene, we have new emergent threat perceptions, the new Cold War, as it were, the breakdown of certainly of the post-Second World War liberal consensus, rising inequalities. In multiple countries, we see the use of political technology marked by messianism, the savior leader, hagiographies of those leaders, including in India, the banalization of violence as being something that is just, that we can just accept. the use of the past as a future, so the promise of returning to a future which is going to be the glorious past that you always already had, the existential creation of an other, underfunding of education and attacks on Indian universities and increase of fees and the protests there, JNU being a prime example, is also in line with this. The instrumentalization of pre-existing resentments, the moral use of an almost medieval, I hesitate to use this word, I'll use it under erasure, depends on which part of the world you're looking at, medieval metaphysical vocabulary of good and evil. So against all of this, and in multiple countries again, and I apologize in advance, you have to indulge me if I'm repeating myself from some of the other talks, but this does need to be said. In multiple countries, what we are seeing is an electorally legitimated rise of misogynist authoritarianism. I say electorally legitimated because yes, these people come to power through winning elections, but they're not necessarily democratic and certainly not substantively so. So it's the rise of an electorally legitimated misogynist authoritarianism that claims a monopoly on nationalism, comes to power by claiming to challenge neoliberalism, but actually profits from it, usually by means of crony capitalism. I would say pick a country off the globe and any of the significant countries where the crisis is going on, it's literally the same formula. So this is, and within that context, there's the assumption, there's this presumed modernity of India because it was once colonized, because it is a democracy, and that somehow that renders it immune. And that narrative is really powerful, not just in India, but actually even more so outside of India, that this therefore is not a problem, cannot be a problem because India is a democracy. But one has to think about how do we know what is the democratic invariant? How do we recognize what a democracy looks like and feels like? And certainly in the cases that I'm talking about, it doesn't look and feel like a democracy at all. Now, when we come to the question of Kashmir, the history of it, yeah, I think I also want to add that in the post-colonial context, we have this very problematic nation state, which is burdened with the legacies of Westphalian sovereignty and in a late modern capitalism, and it's just not able to carry all of that. In the context of Kashmir, I think I would. I think in the 19th century, the 1846 Treaty of Amritsar, which is again. You may or may not know, is the treaty through which the territory of the erstwhile state of Kashmir was bought, was bought from the Sikhs and sold to the Dogra Hindu rulers by the British. It was bought for the equivalent of a something like 75,000 pounds, and that was bought the territory along with the people, no consent, obviously in those days. But I don't think it is, again, recognizing the nuances and complexities of history is important. So the fact that it was bought and sold by the British doesn't mean that there wasn't awareness or there weren't people who were resisting the Dogra rule, both the Kashmiri Muslims themselves, and there was a class divide there, with the Kashmiri Muslims, peasants, artisans, etc. And also there were people who were able to see it at the time. So a former British Army soldier in the late 19th century, Robert Thorpe, his grave is in Srinagar, and his grave says first martyr for Kashmir. His book was called Kashmir Misgovernment. So there were people who have been able to see the repressive Dogra rule. Of course, Mridu Rai's book, Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects, does a very good job of excavating that entire history. So the 19th century was this period of time. Now we come to the start of, and also it's important to remember that many of that incipient Kashmiri nationalism, so this question of religion and rights, incipient Kashmiri nationalism there was this ideological traffic between it being based on a notion of religion and it being based on an idea of rights. And at various times, these two things, there was interchange. So in the late 19th century, there was a Shalbagh rebellion, weavers, and it was one of the earliest things that we would recognize as a strike against conditions in a feudal era. So there was all of that. Then in the early 20th century, you have the emergence of Sheikh Abdullah, the important Kashmiri nationalist leader, and his legacy is again very complex because he's one of those Kashmiri leaders who is who's the leader of the national conference, not the Muslim conference, and in transforming in playing his role, trying to transform Kashmiri nationalism and give it a more rights-based vocabulary as opposed to a religion-based vocabulary, he bargains with the Indian state and gets treated very badly, in effect removed from power unceremoniously at the start of the 50s. in 53, and then spends a lot of time in jail. So in fact, there is from the very beginning two contesting narratives. One is around religion and nation, and the other is around rights and nation. This is not just the case in Kashmir, it is also the case in India. So the RSS, the organization I referred to earlier, was set up in 1925. So this is before even India and Pakistan come into being as post-colonial states. And the RSS has this explicit motive. In fact, they actually support British rule in India over the anti-colonial struggles which are led by the Congress. So the RSS is set up in 1925, and through the late 40s and early 50s, there are two competing ideas of Indian nationalism. One is this idea that is embodied by those who are in line with the RSS way of thinking, and their idea is that India ought to be this kind of a Hindu nation. And Kashmir is a very important project for them. If you read the correspondence at the time between Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah, or Nehru and the Dogra ruler at the time, the king, and then his son, you see these kinds of contestations. So there are these agitations which are happening in line with the feudal and the ruler wanting to maintain his role, trying to ally with the Hindu nationalist forces at the time, especially in Jammu, the Praja Parishad and others. So Kashmir, what is happening in Kashmir now, was a long unfinished project of that version of Indian nationalism, of India as a Hindu nation. The other version of Indian nationalism, with all its problems, was embodied by the figure that is most reviled by the current regime in India, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. Because Nehruvian idea of Indian nationalism was secular, and secular socialists were later added to the constitution, but was kind of like a rights-based idea. Now, again, I'm using this under erasure because there are enough and more critiques also of how it was in theory that, but in practice, it was also equally problematic and Brahminical and did not do enough to look at things around caste, for example, and was embodied in these big statesmen who were doing this bargaining over people and their rights. So Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah fall out. Sheikh Abdullah is removed from power, and since then, up until the 80s, you see the gradual erosion of Kashmir's autonomy. That article was put in the constitution because Kashmir's accession to India. Okay, then there's the line of control story, but maybe you can ask me about it. Kashmir's accession to India was conditional upon a plebiscite being held. That plebiscite was never held, hasn't been held. In fact, if you look at newspapers from the time, it says Kashmir accedes to India, plebiscite soon to be held, which was never held. The UN this was one of the most important disputes that the UN was involved in over the course of the 50s, and with trying to make various efforts to resolve it. But anyway, Nehru's legacy is problematic in the same way that Sheikh Abdullah's legacy is problematic. These were figures who were trying to do something other than in explicit religious terms. And for much of the world, I actually often suspect maybe the idea of a Hindu nation is not as problematic as it ought to be. Because certainly if you think about that Huntingtonian, non-critical post-colonial idea, the West is Christian, Muslim countries are Muslim, India has Hindus, and what's the problem with India being a Hindu nation in that line of thinking? I feel that does injustice to an understanding of the experiment of the kind of nationalism that was there in India from, say, the end of the 40s up until the end of the 20th century, specifically, before Hindutva again becomes resurgent. So there are these two competing versions of Indian nationalism. Then in the 80s, and the erosion of autonomy also meant the banning of various parties, such as the Plebiscite Front. In 1984, there was the appointment of a governor, and from that period, from over the next decades, from the 50s to the 80s, you have what I call a Mandarin-Machiavelli interaction between the center and the state, so that if governments there are not compliant to the center, they're simply removed, and governor's rule is imposed. And this has become, this was the norm, like governments would just not be seen as something that was important to honor the mandate of the people. In the 80s, once Jagmohan is appointed as the governor in 84, during his first stint, he's an RSS person, avowedly so. He also later comes back in the 90s, at the start of the 90s, when the Kashmiri Pandit exodus happens. And through the late 80s, following on from the 87 elections, you have this current phase. So that current phase is the only phase that you hear about in India, that, you know, Pakistan sponsored terrorism, Muslim extremists, typical Orientalist other kind of story. And they, there was the exodus of the Hindu minority. They killed and raped Hindu women. They told the people to leave Kashmir, or to either convert, join the resistance, or leave. Now which is not, it's not that it's incorrect, it is just that how and what purposes are served by constantly weaponizing these two histories against each other. Because then what starts to happen is, this many, and again the numbers here depends, because there isn't enough official even initiative or attempt to try and create any kind of factual certainty around any of this. But then it becomes something like, well, 219 Kashmiri Pandits were killed according to this report. What about the 40, very conservative estimate, to 60 to even 90,000 Kashmiri Muslims who've been killed? Not all combatants. So then it becomes like a game of numbers. People weaponize that by this competing victimhoods, and people say, well, there was Sarla Bhatt, who was a nurse, and she was so brutally raped because she was Hindu. And then people say, well, there was Kunan Poshpara, where the Rashtriya Rifles went in and the army conducted mass rapes. What about that? So it just becomes this endless story of what is in fact a political dispute, becomes very successfully communalized in line with the rise of Hindutva moment in India at the start of the 90s. And then it just becomes only seen through that communal lens of India-Pakistan or Hindu-Muslim, and the political dispute becomes something that becomes existential rather than political, that is embodied by the figure of these others. And this gains new momentum in the, in recent years with a wider global Islamophobic climate. So there is, of course, the line, because there is a line of control, there is also, of course, a Pakistan-administered side of Kashmir, that Pakistan is called Azad Kashmir, which means free Kashmir. And then there is another, there are other regions of that former princely state, Gilgit-Baltistan. There's Ladakh. So this is a composite Himalayan territory where people are multilingual, they have different identities in different regions, they are trading with each other, they are communicating with each other, and with the after ending of the colonial rule, what it becomes is that it becomes bracketed into this line of control, which is a dotted line on a map, but nowhere in India will you see it. No map in India will show you the exact factual status of the thing, that there's this division of the territory. There's always this complete territory, including the territory that is administered and has been for as far back as it has existed by Pakistan. So there's a way in which knowledge regime also functions to support this. So this region has become a tragedy because of its complexity and because of the two post-colonial powers and the way in which their contestations have not actually taken the people into account at all. Okay, what do I want? Okay, I'll just read a little bit. So, but by highlighting the complexity, I don't mean to say that Kashmir is an intractable conflict. It is about vested interests. It is about entrenched perceptions. These can be changed. It is a very, I think it's really important, I think as scholars, ever more, that we unashamedly unsex the notion of strategy. Honestly, what's strategic about inhibiting better economic ties? What's strategic about enabling endless polarization and internal breakdown? What's really strategic about increasing regional insecurity, including for the minorities that you ostensibly care about? This is not strategy. This is a very narrow, projection of something as national interest, but at the same time it is being constructed by actors who stand to benefit from it. So there's really nothing strategic about what India is doing. I think we shouldn't even give that word to these countries that do that, whenever any country that does that. This is, and also then it enables the use of words like strategy and sensitive place, enables, these are euphemisms for the kind of cloak and dagger politics, a lack of transparency, and the stifling of people's expectations. The other part I think that I also want to tell you, and this is important in the context of religion, probably obviously not relevant just for Kashmir, is that the progressive nature of early 20th century Kashmiri nationalism. So Sheikh Abdullah was a socialist. In the late 40s, early 50s, Kashmir is one of those places that, suddenly his name's escaped me, Madeleine Albright's father, Joseph Corbett, wrote about as the most dangerous place on earth, because this is where communism could really spread from. You know, Sheikh Abdullah also goes and meets Chow En-lai. So this is in the Cold War polarization. Kashmir, with that version of its progressive nationalism, becomes especially a dangerous place in that perception, in that geopolitical perception that, you know, these people are not the kind of people we want to see. So coming to the present, I think I already told you about the Mandarin-Machiavelli interaction. I think the relationship between the political and the juridical in Kashmir even today is complex. The elections are not a festival of democracy as it is claimed, when they are actually a grotesque carnival of people's subjugation in a very militarized zone where you have various phases of elections, that you have double-digit numbers of polling booths where zero votes are cast. So people who participate in elections are represented by political parties that, and there are two main ones, it's the classic divide and rule from the center, two main political parties that do not have widespread support amongst the people. They're seen as compradors of the Indian government at the center, depending which one. There's the National Conference and the People's Democratic Party. What has happened recently, both of them have been made irrelevant. So even their leaders were incarcerated. So this is why it's a whole new level of strangeness, because all of these people who have been collaborating with the Indian government, who have actually who don't have the support of a lot of Kashmiri people because of the stance they have taken politically, are also made irrelevant and put in restricted from movement. And from some of the messages, it seems, and also from the court judgments, written orders are not given. So if you take that case to court, the court says, well, where's the proof of it? And there is no proof, because these are orders given over the phone. And the Union Territory demotion from being a state to a Union Territory is also relevant, because then the police forces become accountable to the center. There's anyway a military exception, endless state of, an accountant sort of exception from the 90s onwards, with laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the Public Safety Act, under which no convictions of armed forces have ever been held for any encounters, enforced disappearances, and there are over 8,000 enforced disappearances. In this recent iteration, people were stopped from going to pray at one of the most revered Hazrat Bal shrines on a holy day. So there's this kind of this humiliation and subjugation which is central to this project. I'll talk about the challenges first. I want to mention a couple of challenges. The first one is this discourse of competing victimhoods. It has no end. I urge Indians and I urge people who care to understand that this discourse of competing endless victimhoods has no end. If you care, and the reason I'm emphasizing this, because the standard response to all of this is, what about Kashmiri Pandits? The Muslims drove them out. And I've always, emphasized, and no matter how many times I do it, I will, people always come back to me and say, well, you're a traitor, you didn't speak about Kashmiri Pandits. I am speaking at every venue about them. I'm saying, please ask the Indian government to acknowledge the massacres, all of the massacres of the Sikhs, of the Muslims, of the Kashmiri Pandits, and to open commissions of investigation into those massacres. Please punish the perpetrators. Please do it for the Pandits, do it for the Muslims, do it for the Sikhs. It's very commonsensical, right? Anywhere, that's the only way you can move forward. But there is literally, the Supreme Court a few years ago gave the judgment that happened to a Kashmiri Pandit, right-wing Kashmiri Pandit group, to say that happened 27 years ago, we can't really open those files. It's too long in the past. Now, there are, there is, as a people who have lived in this kind of fractured trust, there are numerous, endless conspiracy theory amongst Kashmiris, and one of those is that, well, maybe there's the role, because there are also militants and counter militias. And I just keep saying, well, please declassify the files, please open the investigations into the massacres. This is just a very basic thing about opening investigations into massacres, including the Kashmiri Pandit ones. Because instead of using that endlessly to justify a rape for a rape, a death for a death, and everything else that has been going on. So that's the first challenge. And to ask that these narratives are immunizing for specific sets of people. But we have to understand how they console, whom they console, and who do these narratives work for. And they don't work for the vast majority of Indians anyway, and they certainly don't work for Kashmiri Pandits, whose potential return is rendered ever more insecure given what's happened over the last 2 months. So that's one. I think that it also enables, for those who talk about it, is this, I think I already mentioned the cultural use of ignorance, and I think that's very systematic and important. Okay, then I want to go to this part where I want to say, well, what does talking about it, how does talking about it help anyway? Why is theory relevant? And I want to say theory is relevant, thinking about it is relevant, obviously in the most standard sense, the Arendtian sense, that totalitarianisms happen when there is a failure of thinking in the political sphere. Power and violence are opposites. If you need violence, then it isn't power. If the resort to that kind of violence means you don't have consent. So there's that reason why thinking is important, obviously. But there's also, I think, a way in which we have to think in, with, and through the ideas of sovereignty that we have inherited. And I want to just read a quote here. So if I can find it, yes. Because I feel like one of the key kind of analytical issues here is the post-colonial instantiation of sovereignty. And what happens with Kashmir is that this political settlement of a people, the Kashmiris, they may at that point have called themselves people of Jammu, people of, Baltis, Gilgitis, Ladakhis, whatever, but people of that erstwhile state, of the different regions, that there is a religion-based partition of territory and population transfer when India and Pakistan are created at the same time from this subcontinent, right? There's a religion-based partition and this two-nation theory, and there's a population transfer with large numbers of people being killed. But these terms are decided by a formerly colonial third party, which is the UK in this case. But they have to be honored by two newly sovereign political entities which are also democratic, so they have their internal compulsions, India and Pakistan, for a fourth territory, the Kashmiris themselves, where the rulers and the people are divided in their religion, and quite significantly so. So the population is Muslim, and the rulers are Hindu, and it's been a fairly repressive rule of various kinds of things, bonded labor, excessive taxation, no relief during famines, and so on, the standard kind of colonial sort of story. So then that is why the solutions cannot come just from within, although the people of all of these regions need to be a part of those solutions. So I find the idea of moving from, various IR scholars, but I always go back to Groboki's work, this idea of regimes of sovereignty to be so important, that we have to think of sovereignty in the way in which it is, it's not a transparent fact, both juridically and empirically. And quote, these regimes are instituted by various modern hegemons united by an ethos of hierarchy and privilege on the one hand and corresponding mechanisms of subordination and discrimination on the other. And that they include, and this is really important, the regulation of knowledge, production and circulation of means of war and violence to their advantage. These are if I read to you, I hope I'm okay. No, okay, fine. A few more minutes? Yeah, okay. So if I read to you, and it always strikes me as being significant, if I read certainly to anyone who has been to Kashmir, and my new friends here will tell me if I'm right or wrong, if I read to you these paragraphs, that the besieged villages and towns are sealed off and cut off from the world, daily life is militarized, freedom is given to local military commanders to use their discretion as and when to shoot, movement between territorial cells requires formal permits, local civil institutions are systematically destroyed, the besieged population is deprived of their means of income, invisible killing is added to outright executions. Another paragraph. To live under this occupation is fortified structures, military posts, roadblocks everywhere, buildings that bring back painful memories of humiliation, incidentally former tortured centers converted, whitewashed, painted and converted into government buildings. Painful memories of humiliation, interrogations, beatings, curfews that imprison hundreds in their cramped homes every night from dusk to day, soldiers patrolling unlit streets, frightened by their own shadows, children blinded by rubber bullets, in the case of Kashmir, pellets, so not even rubber bullets. Parents shamed and beaten in front of their families, soldiers urinating on fences, shooting at the rooftop water tanks just for fun, chanting loud offensive slogans, pounding on fragile tin doors to frighten children, confiscating papers, dumping garbage in the middle of a residential neighborhood, border guards kicking over a vegetable stand or closing borders at whim, bones broken, shootings and fatalities, a certain kind of madness. Now, if I ask people who have been to Kashmir, that does this, and whenever I've done, does this sound like Kashmir? Of course it does, but this is not about Kashmir. It's Medembe stuff on necropolitics talking about Palestine. So there is a way in which the exercise of power, the exercise of sovereignty is very necropolitical in the case of Kashmir as well, and we need to know more about it. Even though it, and it's really important to know this necropolitical arithmetic as it's working in the case of Kashmir. And, okay. And all this is legitimated by India being a democratic state. It's not a case of ancient hatred, but it's just also, I find, deeply offensive. It should be deeply offensive to any Indians too, and this is why I'm always trying to speak to people who do not agree with me. It should be deeply offensive to anyone in whose name this is being carried out. And there need to be a lot more solidarities on that issue. Okay, what else? Okay. What do I want to, oh yes, I do want to say that I won't go into self-determination, maybe if you ask me, but I think there's a remedial right case certainly to be made. Okay, the centrality of Kashmir to the Indian Hindutva project, and at this point what we see is this exercise of arbitrary power, which is betting on different combinations of resignation or indignation. People, right now even as we speak, people being made destitute, and the idea is to just break down their resilience. And the fact that this is being done, how do I forget that? This whole thing is being done in order to save them from themselves. It's as if Spivak never said, what is it, white men saving brown women from brown men. It's like that never happened. It's like the whole colonial critique never happened. Because here we have this story of this explicit story that we're doing this to save Kashmiri women. And at the same time, save Kashmiri women from Muslim, Islamic barbarianisms of various kinds. And at the same time, you have these claims being made in the Indian media, including by BJP leaders in the aftermath of this change on August the 5th, to say, well, now we can go and own land there. Now we can go and marry those fair women there. So it's this typical Orientalist, exotic other trope, so that these people can either be very cruel and barbaric, or they can be amazing, exotic, other. So gender is used. There are specific ways in which this is sought to be legitimized by saying that this is going to increase the rights for Kashmiri women. I think I have that somewhere. I can go over the counter arguments to it, because even legally they do not hold. So it's to save the women. It's to say it's because of LGBTQ rights, but as if the people who are there, who are living under this for a long time, but also in its recent iteration, those LGBTQ people are not somehow Kashmiris as well. So it's that claim. Also, again, there is a court judgment which makes it quite clear that the Indian decriminalization of homosexuality also already applies. So these are also things that are not legally, they do not legally hold up to scrutiny. They're just used in a fast and loose way on TV studios to, for people to say, oh yes, see, we're liberating them. The third part of the story is development, that it's being done for their economic development. If it's being done for their economic development, then the very basic question again, and sometimes the simplest questions need repeating over and over again, why aren't they on board with it? Why haven't they ever been asked in all of these changes that have happened over the last 2 months? surely, I mean, surely it would have been possible to at least gather together some, even surface, even, created number of voices to say, yes, yes, we want this. Not a single, there was not a single instance of Kashmiris being consulted in this entire change at all, this August the 5th onwards. So this idea that it's being done for their development is, it's truly hollow. It's truly hollow. Kashmir's indicators, economic indicators, as well as social indicators, are better than for many Indian states. And that is something that Gendres and other economists have pointed out. I also have them somewhere here, so if you want, I can tell you more detail. But that these indicators are not that bad. Kashmiris are not a society that has, there's not a lot of destitution. There's certainly not the kind of homelessness you see in India. Indians from various Indian states go to the region, including to the valley, in the summer months to work. So you actually have migrant workers from India going to the region to earn a living. So this idea that somehow this is going to make them well off is not, add to which you have this whole, the destruction of the businesses, the IT sector, everything, education, through what has unfolded, especially over the last few months. So it really doesn't, I mean, factually, empirically, none of these claims hold up to scrutiny. Now, if that development story is one that it can somehow be, first of all, why should there be a choice between economic and political rights? Why should development and being able to exercise their development freedom be a choice? And apart from colonial powers that are explicitly colonial, who gives that choice? Who says, well, you can either have your livelihood or you can have a say, but not both? So that does not make sense. But also the question of development needs to be taken with a big pinch of salt, given India's own economy and given the fragile, mountainous ecosystem and environmental concerns in that region itself. So it's so a kind of unaccountable development that does not seek consent, take people on board, has the potential to actually really destroy and cause environmental catastrophes. So another reason why people outside should care. I think are we running out of time? Yeah, 2 minutes? Okay, right. It's, yes, time is just one of those things, but I should not see this. This is Switzerland, so I ought to actually keep to time. All right, so I just want to always say at the end that I end up sounding really depressing because I say these horrible things and I have even barely scratched the surface because I just feel like I could just keep telling you about the human shields, keep telling you about the numbers of deaths, keep telling you, but that's endless. So I want to say things can be done. We can witness. We can be disruptive of these common sense, this kind of common sense rhetoric that is perpetuating violence. I feel like, especially as scholars, we have a key role in not taking the frameworks just as given, because we are representing those, creating those frameworks at the same time that we say we're merely utilizing them. So I think that it is important to argue, for instance, on sovereignty, on strategy, on development, on political problems, that there are these other ways of looking at this situation, and that is the only actually both commonsensical and also a humane way of going about it, because otherwise we have multidimensional losses from violence and misplaced priorities, exhausted humanity, because this is also then something that that takes away kind of standard master slave thing. It's also taking away from the humanity of the people who are getting used to this banalization of violence. Disputed and divisive politics and governmental overreach. I think that that much as they believe that, much as at the present configurations of power believe that they can somehow change names of buildings, Sher-e-Kashmir Stadium, the stadium named after Sher-e-Kashmir, the Lion of Kashmir, named after Sheikh Abdullah, that would be changed to Sardar Patel's or some other Hindu nationalist leader. And so on. I'm sure everything named after Nehru would be changed. So one can do those sorts of things, but every symbolic act like that, were it to be carried out, would only continue adding to that humiliation, entrench that perception, and not let any move forward happen. So unless we've invented a device, and a lot of political leaders these days seem to be acting as if such a device has been invented, that can change people's minds from within. Unless that has been invented actually, and we're just not aware of it, you cannot take away from the fact that there are actual physically embodied people, and that those people are a part of the territory that is being claimed, and that doing this is only an invitation to much greater violence by non-state actors, by the militants as well, and that will just further create insecurities both there in the region and more globally. And it's something that I think everyone ought to worry about. The relevant counterfactuals are good, but some of them are pretty bad too. So our action is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The floor is going to be open for discussion, but I would like to use my position of privilege to start. And just a short question that I want to ask right now, because as you know, I'm a professor of anthropology. I'm interested in human rights. I teach also human rights. And I'm interested in understanding what the language of human rights has been able to do that perhaps could not have been done without them to address the situation in Kashmir. Because if I understood your talk correctly, it seems to me that there is a potential in using the language of human rights for derailing this dominant communitarian narrative of Hindu versus Muslims. And if it is the case that human rights have this potential, is this language audible in India at the moment?
Thank you. Thank you. So the language of human rights has been really important in enabling documentation. So there are organizations and lawyers and individuals, but specifically what comes to mind is something like the APDP, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, which was set up by someone called Parveena Angar over 2.5 decades ago. Her son was one of the victims of enforced disappearances, and so that organization on the 10th of every month holds a vigil on International Day of the Disappeared. In publicly, they're actually not speaking about politics at all. They just stand there with the pictures of those who are disappeared, and they draw attention to the fact that where are these people? Either give us their bodies or tell us what happened to them. Now and this is an elderly woman. She's been nominated for the Nobel Prize as well, Peace Prize as well. So even that sort of thing this year was not allowed. So even they were not allowed. These very elderly, absolutely non-threatening people who would have gathered just with their pictures, even that was not allowed. So the human rights thing allows organizations like the APDP, JKCCS, Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, and various such organizations to document, to actually at some point in the future, perhaps justice will be done, but there is a documentation and work, and very often, Indians also go and work with these organizations, because those especially like young people and others who care for human rights. So there is that linkage. It is so that's the big advantage of the language of human rights. The disadvantage is that, not disadvantage, that's the wrong word to use. The limitation, the constraint of the language of human rights is that the focus is on human rights violations, and of which we have enough and more evidence, including the OHCHR report recently, which was unprecedented, but there was just no. In Indian media, it was just, they're saying that we don't have to take it seriously. It's not, even though they were talking about both sides, Pakistan and Kashmir as well. So the constraint is that language does not enable people to understand why are there human rights violations in the first place. So it's basically that, which is, I'm not saying that that's not in itself still really important, because perhaps if more people are aware of the human rights situation, they would then be able to see that these human rights violations are happening in order to silence certain voices, and those voices are being silenced because of these reasons. It's not as if even that there is a spectrum of voices in which you hear different opinions, which one might not have a problem with at all and ought not to. But the point is that certain ends of that spectrum are just not audible. It's just not. So there was and this is again actually empirically the case, torture reports. India suspended an article recently. There's all of the evidence on torture and it doesn't get any coverage in the Indian media. So it is one wonders that, how it can go on for that long with that level, systematic amount of limitation of the spectrum. But it's not audible in India. People it is audible to very small numbers of people overall who are already either concerned with human rights or have had some interaction with Kashmiris themselves, but not generally.
I think there's a microphone. Yes.
I don't have any question in particular, but I wanted to just make two quick comments. So from what I gathered from the talk, there is two things underlying the conflict. The first is the idea of justice. So like you spoke about the competing narratives, so if there is a Pandit narrative of exodus and exile, and the Muslim narrative of occupation and oppression, at the heart of both the narratives lies the idea of justice which is not delivered. So as someone who believes in democracy and the idea of sovereignty, I think justice also becomes important in imagining ourselves as people. And the second was consent, which also flows from the idea of sovereignty. So be it the accession of Kashmir to the Indian state, so who was acceding and whether the population agreed with it or not, or say something which was done on the 5th of August with India unilaterally abrogating the article again, who was on board and who was doing it. So the idea of consent and sovereignty, as someone who believes in democracy, it becomes very, very important. So I just wanted to make this comment.
I think I'll let you respond to the comments first.
I just want to say yes, thank you, Surya, absolutely. And that reminded me this thing about competing narratives and looking at colleagues who work on other conflicts. It's not only in the case of Kashmir, although more progress seems to have been made in the case of other conflicts to overcome than in the case of Kashmir. But one of the things that these competing narratives also do is that they systematically overlook previous instances of cross-community solidarity. So they do not talk about important Pandit figures in Kashmiri history, Kashmiri Pandit Hindu figures in Kashmiri history, or Kashmiri Muslim figures who actually work together for towards a similar cause. So it also erases that history and selectively portrays this as being always the case that these were completely different competing narratives. And I think part of that work is also important to highlight. Well, look, in the past there are all these Premnand Bazaz, of course, is a prime example, and the people around the 1944 Kashmir Manifesto. So there was a progressive history of both these communities, people from both these communities. And on gender, I mean, the issue of consent always brings me to gender, because this kind of, it's the territoriality, and it's the way in which this kind of, it is a kind of hegemonic masculinist nationalism that says, we'll do whatever it takes, but we will not cede an inch of territory. And that's literally the language that is used, and it takes various forms. And in a Feminist Review article, I talked about the representation, the role played by representation of Kashmir, cartography, the way in which the geo-body of India is represented and Kashmir is seen as the head, and how that links in with all these questions of Mother India and the beheading of the mother, and possession. This idea again of consent not mattering. That whether you say yes or no, it doesn't matter what the Kashmiris say. It takes me back to a famous movie from the 1990s in India, Shah Rukh Khan, who is still, I think, a very good actor. And in that movie, there is a very famous song which can be translated as, whether you say yes or no, you are mine. And throughout the movie, he says, Kiran is the name of the girl, and it starts with K, and he stutters and he says K. So it's almost as if he was saying Kashmir. It literally is a very comfortable, has been a very comfortable trope. It doesn't really matter. You belong to me, and that's explicitly also including by political commentators referred to as the relationship as a marital one, or one with a mistress who's just being petulant and all she needs is subduing. And this is there are people who've explicitly said that without any without any irony or understanding of why that might be problematic.
Okay, so I'll go just for one question so that the audience can also ask some questions. You talked about Kashmiris as the killable subject. So I was just wondering whether you can elaborate a bit more about the construction of impunity in Kashmir.
Do you want me to do that one by one? Or you can just-
However you
Yeah, I think maybe take a few questions because I could just go on and then I'd be like, I've spoken too much.
Thank you, madam. Actually, first of all, I must say that as a journalist, I am with the Kashmiri people. But when I listen to your talk, it has a no path. Sometimes you go right, sometimes you go left. Like you said, RSS. They have 5 million people RSS. You know about that? It exists from in India from 1925.
Yes.
How you compare RSS 5 million people with the 1 billion people? They are not representing of the India. I mean, I'm telling this audience must understand India is another role, another look. India is trying to reach on the moon. And second thing I tell you, like you told about the human rights, I am a victim of the human rights. Human rights become compromised, being compromised all around the world. Can you imagine, I cannot go in United Nations office. They didn't tell me till today what I did wrong. This is human rights being compromised, and I know who is behind it. I was arrested in China by Thai intelligence agencies. And second thing I told you, my question is this. Like you told that about the West and the Europe. They are saying they give many statements about that. But when I have glanced on the Islamic states, they are more than 50. Just 2 countries. I mean, Turkey and Malaysia. None of others say a single word about Kashmir. What do you think? What do you say about that? Thank you.
Maybe one more in the house.
Professor Kaul, thanks a lot for your talk. The most that I appreciate about your stand is that you're willing to engage with somebody who disagrees with you. On that count, I have 2 comments and 1 question. The first comment is the most recent one that you made about John Rees. I'm sure you're aware, John Rees' stand on Kashmir having a different kind of development model which is better than the rest of India. I think even he missed out. I think you did, in the main talk. John Rees.
Oh, John Rees. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
The one in the Chhattisgarh University, yeah. I think even he missed out the fact that with 1% of population in Jammu and Kashmir, they get more than 10% of funding from the central government, which means 2/3 of the state government funding comes from the central government grant. So of course they will have a better model. If anything, it shows that the number of Manrega schemes that has failed in Jammu and Kashmir is higher than the rest of India. And the second one is regarding your comment on local elections. We had, I think there was a block development council election and the turnout was 98.3 if I'm not wrong. And of course if people, militants are threatening people to be shot, contestants to be shot, people are not going to come out and vote. But the most keen point that I want you to comment on is the plebiscite. Of course, you've read the UN Resolution 47. The first point, for the benefit of the room, let me read it out. In the first step, Pakistan was asked to use its best endeavors to secure and withdraw all of its tribesmen and Pakistani nationals, putting an end to fighting in the state. Because this doesn't happen at all, the step 3, which is plebiscite, doesn't happen. Is it, what is your comment on this?
Shall I respond now?
Yes.
All right. So in that order, Fabian, the killable subjects, yes, it's the dehumanization, and as a precursor to the fact that a loss of life is just collateral damage. And so in 2016, when pellet guns were used on protesters, and up until most recently in Chile, they weren't used anywhere else. So this is also the way in which these technologies travel, as it were. So. In those pellet blindings, that summer of pellet blindings, there were people who, a lecturer who questioned, in crew, who questioned the forces who were raiding his home. He was killed. An ATM guard was found pumped with 300 plus pellets in his body. He was returning late from work. It was night, so he was mistaken for someone else. So it's not the fact that individuals cannot or will not, in moments of hate, violence, whatever, some moment of passion, do these things that are terrible. It's the fact that there isn't a systematic procedure for holding people accountable. So the legal impunity that is so if it's an emergency act, And it's not only in Kashmir, in states in the northeast, it's been in place for longer. How is it democratic to have an emergency legislation that protects the armed forces from, gives them immunity for decades altogether? So it's a systematic construction of enablement of a dehumanization. And to construct that subject as an other and also as a subject that is not human enough. And we see that. I want to respond to both of your questions. So firstly, RSS is not representative of India. On that, I would have no disagreement with you were that to be the case. But I think that is not even wrong, because there is a limit to, if you're looking inductively at particulars, and you say, well, that's just an individual thing, that's just an individual thing, that's just, at what point do those numbers of individual particulars become deductively something that we can see as a pattern? And I would argue, and I would request you to read, various things, but specifically, like there's this scroll article called the Hindutva Project in India, where there's enough and more evidence. So how is the RSS not, if it is not representative of people, then more people should be challenging that project. Then more people should be saying that it's not okay to drop the mention of India's first Prime Minister from a textbook. It's not okay to have hashtags like delete Mughals from history. It's not okay to have assassinations, lynchings of media persons, atheists and rationalists. It's not okay for elected parliamentarians to go and garland lynching convicts. It's not okay for the courts to pass judgments where they let people go on bail. It's certainly not okay for the chief minister of the most populous state in the country, Uttar Pradesh, firebrand Hindutva leader, firebrand inverted commas, obviously the NYT is affecting me, who's tipped to be the next Modi, should Modi not be valuable enough for the RSS at some point, to have shared a stage with somebody who called for the exhumation of the graves of dead Muslim women and to rape them. And it's not okay for a parliamentarian to be elected, Pragya Thakur, to be elected after having said that Godse, the assassin of Gandhi, did right. Please let me complete. That Godse was right. I did listen to you. I did listen to you, so would you please let me complete, because that's how communication can happen. Sure, but I would not want to just, but I wouldn't want to speak over you, right? I think it's important that we have communication. So it's not okay for somebody to be elected to the parliament as another parliamentarian, and then this woman who is one of the people accused in a case of right-wing terror blast, to be appointed to the defense panel by the government. It's not okay to have a parliamentarian who says, if we win in 2019, we won't have elections in 2024. So what I'm saying is that one could say, yes, of course, one could keep referring to the exceptions, but I'm saying there's a systematic pattern, and I'm not the only one saying it. And there is a growing literature that documents this. Now, to your second concern, of course, I can't comment on your specific particular case of UN, etc., and whatever. I feel like intelligence, military actors everywhere need to be convinced, about this kind of stuff too. But to your second point, this is not about. So what I'm saying actually does not bring dishonor to India. What people who speak about human rights and democracy are saying are not bringing dishonor to the country that they are talking about. They are actually, in a standard, classic, thorough sense, they are actually serving with their conscience. And this is important, because what kind of honor would it be for any citizen to have in a country that can do this sort of thing with impunity? And I understand that within the context of the West, and this is why the selectivity and the hypocrisy of norms on human rights and democracy when enforced by the West has also been problematic. But it's not just limited to any one part of the world. There is no kind of, moral high ground when it comes to any state. And I feel like that is why it is really important to recognize the human in all of this. This is not about making Indians feel bad about being Indians. This is about understanding that what is happening is deeply problematic. And I just want to make that quite clear. To your question, the thing about, hydropower, well, Kashmir exports power to India, and Kashmiris often go without electricity. So there is a, there is work that I can direct you to that looks at how this idea that we're doing so much for them, giving them this largesse, and that they're being thankless to us, is also problematic. I mean, one could save a lot of money by not making it the most militarized zone in the world. It's not helping people who are suffering, who are being militarized in Kashmir, and also caught between the military and the militants. But it's also not helping those who are impoverished in India, because that's what I meant when I referred to the misplaced priorities. So there's that. The question about the plebiscite, you see, I think it is not a simple one, and I think that certainly the UN resolutions and that idea that Kashmiris have to choose between India and Pakistan perhaps isn't a fair representation of what Kashmiris might want today, since one of their most important slogans is freedom. And in that case, perhaps there should be more thinking. These things can, Northern Ireland at the end of the 90s, post the Good Friday Agreement, wasn't what it was in the 80s. These things they require time and effort to move forward, but certainly, and also perhaps change, structures of international institutions better. This is not a one-person thing. It's not a one-year thing. This is a thing that has to happen at multiple levels all the time. But certainly people having a choice is really important. And no, of course Pakistan is not blameless. On the Pakistani side, of course, any politician who wants to talk about freedom cannot contest elections. They cannot be ahead. They cannot lead the government there if they're not Muslim. So this is not, again, my point is, what does that competition serve? What does this endless kind of mirroring serve? It doesn't. The local elections, since you specifically referred to them, I'm kind of puzzled because it doesn't help your argument. In these bloc elections, BJP was the only party that contested, and the independents. Yes, please look it up online. Please look it up online. There was a high turnout, but BJP was the only party that contested. And certainly, if it is just the militants who are stopping people from, how could the other parties have contested? All the leaders are in prison or otherwise detained. If getting people to vote is really important, then why not negotiate with the leaders? Why not have dialogues with the leaders that have a little more credibility? Why just surely not having dialogue with leaders who have a large following by calling them separatists is not helpful. Surely not having dialogue with with another party in that conflict that even by that stated position has a role, such as Pakistan. Why not have these dialogues? These are the ways in which things can move forward. Not exclusively just this, but also this. Why shut down conversations? Why not have these conversations? And specifically, like why, the poor guy, Farooq Dar, who was used as a human shield by Major Gogoi, and then the Major was given a bravery award before the Human Rights Commission could actually even come up with a report on his behavior. He had gone out to vote. Why treat people who are your people? I mean, honestly, and even given electoral politics, why do this to the PDP and NC leaders? Why do this to what are called the mainstream leaders there? What has August the 5th achieved? I honestly, there is, if you take out the ideological aspect of it, there is just, what it has achieved is utter and complete alienation, deeper entrenchment of injuries, humiliations, more entrenchment of this competing victimhoods, lesser likelihood for Kashmiri Pandits to be safer there, and the enablement of this kind of practice to be used elsewhere, just as Assam NRC was followed by countrywide NRC, and Maharashtra government thing, the way autonomy was revoked on August the 5th, and then you saw what happened in Maharashtra recently. So this is all part of a pattern, and it should be worrying, as I say, for Indians who care.
Okay, so I think we take 3 more questions, and then we will have to. Yes, please. Gentlemen, yeah.
Thanks, Nitasha. The Indian government has constantly said that this is an internal issue. My question really is, why should the world care? You talked a little bit about ideas traveling beyond Indian borders. I mean, you referred to the use of pellet guns in Chile. We recently saw a massive internet shutdown in Iran, and I think the information minister was sanctioned by the US. But what's at stake for the world in this? And the international audience that's here, why should they care? It's just not an Indian issue.
Hello. My question is more related to identity and notions of identity in Kashmir. Would you say a Kashmiri identity or a Kashmiriyat exists in isolation from an Indian or a Pakistani identity, and how would you say the memory of trauma has affected this identity over the years?
It is my understanding, and I could be wrong, that in in fact, the goal for the Hindu ruler at the time was to be independent, and he was caught between two fires. That the Pakistanis should leave, it is an issue of all of them leaving. Nehru himself called, because he treasured Kashmir, he used to call Kashmir his bride, a beautiful woman, which just to reinforce what you were saying. And it is essential, anywhere that there is injustice and that there is violation of human rights, is a place where action has to be taken. There was that, I think it was a Protestant pastor in Germany who kept saying, they came and they took the, so anyway, I won't go into that, you know it. And the last thing, and I think it's important, I don't think this was done in any way, I don't think Kashmir was taken into account. This is a move in order to reinforce Modi within India. So it has to do with politics in India.
Thank you for your talk. I liked that you mentioned that the conflict was intractable. I think that's very optimistic. But given the discourse in India, given the huge amount of fake news and trolling that we see on Twitter, given that a lot of the media companies are just spewing the government rhetoric, it seems like even if there was like a commission to inquire into what happened and sort of these the factual output, I'm just wondering how it would disseminate within the country, and just your thoughts on the state of the media and its impact.
Thank you. So I think yours was the first question, right? So and I think that she kind of also answered your question about why the international community should care. Yeah, it matters less to what India says, or what Pakistan says, or what any government says. I think that states, governments, whatever, they're abstract concepts, but they're made up of real people, and it is important what Indians think or are able to think, and likewise for any other country. But if the territory, if both the countries claim the territory in their entirety, then how can it not be a bilateral issue? So at the least, it is not just an internal issue. Now there are, as I said, there is a fair amount of nebulousness around sovereignty. That it's a regime that we look in history how sovereignty, when and where it has been effected. So there's also potential legal, political, and other means to think about this. So why should the world care? Because I think insecurity, as I was trying to say before, one never wants to be, a doom-monger, but the fact of the matter is that there is an acceleration of violence. There is a banalization and a celebration outright of violence against various kinds of minorities, and this is problematic. This is also a security thing, because it isn't just going to, stay in Kashmir or even India. This is, as I said, these are, we live in a world where technology, movement, and everything else means that the effects, if not necessarily physically directly insecure effects, but certainly economic effects or even political interventions are possible through that. So if you look at, with the UK, the upcoming election on the 12th of December, there was, and there's an Open Democracy article and other articles that came out when this project started, by the mobilization by Hindu diaspora who, who were saying, we must get people to vote for Tories and not get them to vote for Labour. So it also has an impact along how that diasporic, mobilization can skew priorities away from something that ends up serving people there and have links that may actually, in fact, make the situation worse. So there's that kind of political aspect to it. I think there's a learning of these toxic projects, one from the other, and that's another reason why it's important to care. Environmental catastrophes, wars, these kinds of things don't just stay where they are. If there were to be no, I don't really want to make that argument, but there's that thing of, I remember like 20 years ago or more, I was doing my MSc, and in one of the public policy things, I just made some reference to some literature on environmental refugees, and I feel like that was the only thing anyone was interested in, because, oh, refugees, we ought to care, but yeah, I mean, conflict is just, so I don't want to make that argument anymore, but I feel like there are all kinds of arguments that can be made and should be made, especially the ones around economy. And this idea that you can trade with, that you can go on appeasing and trade with regimes that continue to enable the erosion of basic democratic principles. We've seen what it did in history. We've seen that with Germany, with Nazi Germany. And it's not, it's 20th century history is enough to make us think about where these projects lead. And I think it's really important to do so. Plus, I think there are enough people in any context who do actually care. It's more the awareness and with a kind of technological push towards getting us only to know more about what we know and keep us in our adapted realities. I think that's the real challenge of bridging across knowing things that Facebook might not necessarily show us. So that's the active part, but I think that's the thinking totalitarianism. The question about Kashmiriyat, so for those of people in the room who may not know, Kashmiriyat refers to a pan-Kashmiri sense of nationalism. Historically, it is a phrase that is used in different ways. For a certain section of people, Kashmiriyat is just one of those mobilizing tropes through which India says, well, Kashmiriyat, it was all harmonious, and that somehow takes away from all of the violence that has happened and the active betrayal of Kashmiris. But there are others who use this phrase as a way of harking back to the possibility of identities that were, of course, marked by class and caste and other divisions, but still a kind of a pan-Kashmiri way of life, such as you might recognize, and perhaps it's easier to do this in fiction, such as you might recognize in the inflections of speech, in shared rituals, in shared festivities, in neighborliness, in the everyday aspect of lived aspect of identity. And I think it's also generational. So for a previous generation, and I would say both of Kashmiri Hindus and of Kashmiri Muslims, that word would have had more meaning than for the present generation, also because of the physical divide, because of the absence of Kashmiri Hindus there, and the particular presence of Kashmiri Muslims in the imagination of Kashmiri Hindus who've grown up in a Hinduized India post-90s. So that is a physical split, but it's also a kind of empathetic hollowing out because of lack of as it were, the face of the other in a Levinas sense. So I think it's a generational thing. I think different people use it differently, but there are certainly as many critiques also of it, and say that this glosses over and always, a kind of long-standing history of violence, and that it stops us from looking at that. I would personally recognize it in, as I said, in the textures of everyday interaction, the lived interaction with someone who may be a Kashmiri from a different place, region, religion, but there will be a way in which that you could see that, feel that, sense that. Yeah, not very analytical words, but I feel like we don't have to be ashamed of saying we can sense and feel things that are also a part of our understanding. The Hindu ruler, yes, you're right, and the backdrop of this in signing of this instrument of accession, and the ruler who was essentially unrepresentative of the people and deeply unpopular at any rate. And there's the backdrop also of the 1947 Jammu massacre that happens at that time, and the tax revolt that happens in Poonch. So this is a regime at the time that wants to keep its hold and will do whatever it takes. And there's the invasion from the Pakistan side, and the thing of the support from promise from the Indian side on the basis of signing the instrument of accession, which is then conditional upon a plebiscite. So it is as I was saying, it is a problem of the way in which that post-colonial sovereignty was instantiated. These countries were divided and created. Nehru, I mean, some of it is also, like in our time, some of it is also just these men, and I use the word advisedly, I mean, of course, now we see, one way of putting it, we're seeing bromance ruin the world. No, honestly, whichever. Sorry, I forgot that person who asked me this question. Bromance reminds me. Somehow bromance brought Erdogan to mind. I have no idea. But the Muslim countries support for, sorry to just shift paragraphs here, but the Muslim countries do not support exactly my point. If this were a religious issue, you would not have Qatar and, whatever, you name it, countries in West Asia felicitating Modi. If this was actually a religious issue. It's a political issue. So it is only activated in religious terms for when it serves the national interests of specific countries. There's this whole other thing that I can't go into right now, but there's a whole other theoretical thing that, that I have called post-colonial neoliberal nationalism. The ideas of economy and nation do not pre-exist. The economy and nation are not two things. They are sought to be co-constructed by these political, by these projects that create a sense, a governmentality through which the mobilization of post-colonial works as a nostalgia, of a pre-colonial purity, and then the ideas of economy and nation are fused in very interesting ways, and that generate a lot of paradoxes. But that's what's happening, like when you see with the Indian case, and this is why also it's not a religious. Fundamentally, it's a political issue. And I'm not being controversial. Maybe all the soldiers I met were exceptions. So I'll happily say this. There is the Humean problem of induction, but maybe all the soldiers I met were exceptions. But even the soldiers there, Indian soldiers, and you have to feel bad for these soldiers standing next to. I mean, of course, you have to feel bad for the people who are killed, but soldiers standing with guns and brickbats right next to slogans that say, Indian soldiers' dogs go back. They know how deeply unpopular they are in that place, and if you ask them, they will tell you that it is a political, it cannot be solved militarily. It really cannot. As I said, unless you invent that machine that changes people from within, it cannot be solved militarily. But there is this cruel optimism that somehow it can be, on the part of India, that somehow it can be. And that's hurting Indians just as, not just as much, but that is really hurting Indians too. Solidarities, and you're absolutely right, of course, it serves a purpose for them. Kashmir is it's sort of like the jewel in the crown of the Hindutva project, if I may put it in historically evocative colonial past terms. One question here. Oh, that was on a different sheet.
So few among us would deny the merits of a pluralistic society. Would you comment on how Article 370, or rather whether Article 370 made Kashmir more insular than in its absence, in particular by keeping non-Kashmiris out? And secondly, how did that insularity, if any, facilitate religious fundamentalism over the past 30 years? And I'm not talking of Hindutva.
Sorry, could you repeat the second point? How did that insularity?
How did that insularity facilitate religious fundamentalism over the last 30 years, and I'm not referring to Hindutva. Thank you for your talk and your comments. What I'm going to say is somewhere midway between a comment and a question, and it links to the previous question about fake news and media. Given that the revocation of Article 370 was part of the BJP manifesto, and I'm not saying Indians read the manifesto before casting votes, but they don't. But because it's that, and after the revocation, the way Indians celebrated it and said that we were going to buy land and women, and it was not just the politicians, it was people, it was my family who said these things. So how do we engage? Because this time, like last time as you said, it was on, the elections were fought on development a little. This time it was a surgical strike. Hindutva, next time it will be like, oh, we revoked Article 370, give us votes. So how do we engage with everyday Indians in order to change that thing?
Hi, I had two questions. One is, it's a bit, one was a bit surprised when so-called self-professed liberals came out and said that this was long pending, and self-professed liberals in India would come out and say that this was long pending. We are liberals, but Kashmir needed a solution, and there's going to be short-term pain, which is quite surprising, and it's hard to process the hypocrisy. It's hard to read that. It's quite surprising. And the second thing was, I'm wondering, yes, this is religious and political and all of that, but whether there are like really strong economic factors such as hydropower projects and land and access and so on and so forth, whether it's only about that under the garb of trying to address of course it is addressing a religious vote bank, but I'm wondering if economic factors are stronger than we think they are.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question from the previous. It is. I mean, if any conflict is intractable, then what's the point? I think like you have to be able to go from one day to the next and do what one needs to do. It is important to believe in the human capacity to act. The discourse in India is very impoverished, especially on any of the mainstream media. There are a few alternative sources, the Wire, the Scroll, we all know them. But to the extent that it's like old style propaganda. So my congressional testimony was actually edited to take out the words proto-fascist trajectory and then shared, and I only found out about it because some news agency had taken some things out and without informing or bothering to let people know this wasn't the whole thing. So yeah, it's kind of very easy to see through that. What does one do? Links also with that other question. I don't know what does. I think that withdrawal of, understanding ever better how people are enrolled into such projects, which is a part of how their legitimacy is sought to be sustained and projected. So what are the ways in which people are enrolled into agreeing with this and to try and undo that? The standard old, satyagraha. Insistence upon the truth, or the truths, and it's not. It does help that the facts are on the side of talking for human rights and democracy, and I think that's why it's important. And perhaps with all the global crises, maybe this is important everywhere. So to try and link to that, I totally understand. I mean, I would. It's like people at a football stadium. Nobody is above understanding the idea that emotive ideas of religion or nation, be they Hindu nation or a co-religionist identity or a Kashmiri identity, are very important, powerful, emotive projects. People feel a sense of belonging. The point is to understand the ones they alienate and what purpose they serve. Because of course, if you're in that, you have this very strong sense of belonging as part of that project. So the Article 370 actually guaranteed, so the Article 370 was there because apart from defense, telecommunications and foreign affairs, Kashmir was to have its own powers. So these were the three powers that were given to the Indian state. And over time it was eroded, but there was a flag. Initially the Prime Minister was called the Prime Minister of Kashmir. That name was later changed and became a Chief Minister. So there had been these various erosions over time. But essentially this defense, telecommunication and foreign affairs, apart from that, it could make its own laws. Now one could say that was, your point of view is that it enabled an insularity of the people there. I would say that maybe, but that's not, that insularity was there for a reason, because it was a political dispute. It was a measure that was there, that the constitution actually, I mean, by doing this, it's also vandalizing the constitution, because according to the constitution, there were these powers that, apart from them, that the state had. So even on that notion of the state having those powers, and to revoke them without actually following the, if you hear what Kashmiri lawyers have been writing about, that this is, that you needed the agreement of the legislature. So since there's governor's rule, the center also then finds a way of transferring that power to itself and says, well, we needed their legislature, but it's governor's rule, so we get our governor to agree with us, and then we get our parliament to do this to them without asking any of them, and then put all their mainstream and every other leader in detention and silencing. So yeah, I mean the manner is also problematic. So I'm saying that the insularity, how that facilitates religious fundamentalism, I'm saying that insularity, religious fundamentalism of the Islamist kind is not a problem for the Hindutva project. In fact, I think that these fundamentalisms actually mirror each other. Any fundamentalism is quite happy with the elimination of the grey zone. And I feel like, the extent to which the Kashmiris are not actively violent, have not actively been violent, has been a way in which the civil voices, civil society voices have also not been heard. And this is the really tragic, sad fact, that you have the Indian army chief saying, still the army chief by the way, saying 2 years ago that he wished the Kashmiris would use guns instead of stones because then it would be easier to deal with them. So this push towards violence, I mean, I know that it has the appeal for a certain kind of purist project, but what does it do to people in the interim? Why not have listened to people who are actually speaking non-violently? Why not listen to people who are civil society activists, human rights, lawyers, people who why not have these conversations happen? Because I don't think, honestly, on that I would have agreed with the person who's left. I honestly don't think if people actually know, that there's a part of me that would want to believe that they wouldn't give their consent to this if they actually knew, if more numbers of people actually knew. Yes, it was in the BJP manifesto, you're right, and it wasn't read, and people do not read it. Uniform Civil Code is probably the next one. How do we have these conversations with families? Really hard. I hear that all the time, especially from younger people. But that's part of the story, right? It's not just politics, it's not just out there. It's also in the conversations. Highlight the contradictions, highlight the evident dualities, the most egregious. In effect, they're making, this case is getting ever easier to be made because of every next thing that happens, because there is and the self-professed liberals need a solution. Yes, there is a way in which, there's a lot of critical, and I think now this hopefully is less the case, but there's a part of me that wants to think that, but there's a way in which historically even progressive Indians who have been able to see all the other oppressions have kept quiet on Kashmir. And I think that is also partly about the discourse within which they have been shaped, which has been very narrow. If they don't listen to, the point is not that there are violent actors, the point is, are the non-violent ones being listened to? And it's not even the case. So what's so what is that? And the economic, I think the economic is a key part of the story, but I think the economic is sold as part of the nation. Within India, the economic is also being sold as part of the nation. So Ambani, the industrialist, important backer of Modi, announced a Kashmir task force in the aftermath. They were to have a development investment summit in October, but honestly, who would also want to invest there? Right now, why would you want to invest in a place and that is this deeply insecure? It also does not, at least not the kind of investment that will actually bring any development, cannot be made under these circumstances. I'm sorry, I missed one little point about your thing, which is about this insulation and the fact that they have remained. So as I said, in the LGBTQ thing, more than one former Chief Justices of the Jammu and Kashmir High Court have said that, including one called Bashir Ahmed Khan, that the LGBTQ case, the same laws would have applied. The other thing with state subjects is used is to say that it enabled caste-based exclusion, that because, you know, JNK could make its own laws and the state subjects only could get certain positions. Kashmir, also it's important to remember, given that whole progressive history, it's one of the rare places that actually had significant land reforms in the 50s, following on from independence. So the status of Dalits and landless laborers in most Indian states is much higher than in Kashmir. In Gujarat, it's, for example, 67%, in Kashmir, 20%. It's amongst the lowest. So to use all of these things, it's not that the situation of those people isn't bad, but the point is, how is that going to be made better by increasing violence and disenfranchising and silencing the entire population? How is that not going to create more violence and resentment and create this unending thing? The third thing on gender, as I said, the inheritance laws, again, these are things that can be changed, but they do not justify the kinds of changes and the political technology that has been used. So it's not that there isn't a merit for, you know, but these are changes that should happen through the course of law, through dialogue, not through this. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nitasha. Thank you, everyone, for attending this talk. I think I have to close it here. And a few words from Jean-François.
Juste pour vous remercier toutes les quatre de cette séance extrêmement dense, dont je vous rappelle qu'elle a donc été préparée, vous vouliez dire un mot, et qu'elle a été préparée par vous-même, et je vous laisse.
Thank you all for coming here. Thank you very much, Nitasha Kaul, for the talk, Dr. Julie below for having agreed to moderate this, and many, many thanks to Professor Baya, because it wouldn't have been possible without him. Thank you so much. And one very important name, thank you, Fabian, because she's been together, like we've done this together, and she's been a very, very important